Happy Halloween from Encounter Wargaming. Today, we're not going to be doing any wargaming. Instead, you're going to take a journey with me into a strange and horrifying dimension, a world they call Malifaux. What's up, guys? This is Jay from Encounter Wargaming, and today we're going to do something a little different. I'm going to read a little story for y'all. It's called The Last Call at the Grey Lord, written by Graham Stevenson. It's from Malifaux Book 2. It was dark and dank and miserable, which suited Molly perfectly. Where a hard and vigorous rain might have washed the streets and alleys of Malifaux clean, all the brooding clouds had managed to produce was an insipid feathery shimmer that gradually soaked into the old city's brickwork, turning cobbles slimy underfoot and drawing a ripe, fecund stench from the gutters and side streets. Molly's normally explosive hair had wilted into a sodden heap about her neck and shoulders, and even her defiant optimism had grown wet and despondent as day rolled into night. She didn't really feel the cold anymore, which was probably the only positive thing one could take from being undead. But the pall of misery she would normally have resisted vigorously had grown heavier of late, and she was finding it increasingly difficult to remain upbeat. One reason for this was the collection of misfits and surgical rejects that tended to follow her around at a respectful distance. She wasn't certain when it had first started, but had begun to notice them more and more frequently when she walked the city streets at night. If she was attracting them, it certainly wasn't something she was doing consciously, but each night there seemed to be more of them. They kept to the shadows, perhaps from fear of rejection, should their misshapen forms be revealed by gaslight. And all of them exuded the same despondent air, like a cluster of beaten dogs, all hovering nervously for a recalcitrant lick of a master's hand. At times, the bashful gazes that followed her progress through the night held an almost messianic air, which troubled her. It was evident from their behavior that they regarded her as a champion of their cause, which somehow made her feel worse. Though she felt sympathy for their plight and their terrible, secretive existence in the shadows thrown by the living world, she also felt some alarm that they clearly viewed her as being in the same boat, which in turn made her feel deluded and miserable. The real problem, though, was Philip. He hadn't spoken to her for 3 days on account of his new body. Molly couldn't see what the problem was. It had started as a woolly hat, but Molly had discovered a tremendous sense of purpose and well-being from crafting something beneficial for a friend, and she began to elaborate. Although her knitting ability was mediocre at best, she went on to create an entire small knitted body that hung from the brim of the hat, complete with little arms and legs which were stuffed with newspaper. When she showed the finished article to him, Philip declared in no uncertain terms that he would be seen dead again before he would be seen wearing that grotesque carbuncle. Molly reasoned that he would probably warm to it after a bit, and even if he didn't, she had put a lot of effort into making it, and the least he could do was wear it for 1 day. Besides, voicing your dislike for something was all very well when you were a disembodied head, but that's about the limit of your resistance. It's not like you can take it off yourself. So, Molly had stuffed him into this knitted hat body and settled him in the tatty old pram she kept for rattling him around the city. She thought he looked rather cute with his little woolen legs and feet sticking out under his chin. But Philip was positively mortified. He clamped his jaw shut and refused to say another word, instead shooting Molly glares filled with venomous reproach. In the end, she had taken the hat body from him and thrown it away, but Philip refused to relent and maintained his stubborn silence. She was hurt by his callous rejection of her gift, and from the last few days their friendship, normally stable and dependable thing in Molly's otherwise erratic and unpredictable life, had been strained. She'd given up trying to speak to him, and with nothing better to do, silently wheeled him around the streets each night, like the world's gloomiest nursemaid, tending the world's ugliest baby. Tonight's meandering ramble had taken her to a knot of narrow alleys behind the slaughterhouse district, and glints of white animal bone poked from the refuse piled against the alley walls. Bold, sleek rats moved openly through these alleys, grown huge and muscular from generations, reared on raw beef and mutton, more than a match for any enterprising cat. They paused in their foraging to watch Molly and her pram squeak, but showed little interest. Molly stopped at a star-shaped intersection marked by hanging remnants of a poster mottled with lichen and age. The rain, such as it was, still fell in soft misty billows, beating on the pram's rusty metal frame and the bare flesh of her forearms. "Well, where do you want to go now?" she asked the pram. The dark interior remained silent, and somehow still managed to convey a sense of disapproval. "What about down to the river?" she asked. "You like it there? We could sit and watch the bodies float past." More silence from the pram. "Or Curmudgeon Square?" she continued. "There might be some flowers left over. That would brighten things up, wouldn't it?" Philip said nothing. Molly sighed. "Oh, come on, Philip. Don't be such a baby." The silence was suddenly impregnated with a sense of scoffing indignation, and reminded Molly she had been wheeling him around in that pram for 3 days. A slender, willowy girl walked past the alley mouth, some 30 yards in front of them. She was so pale-skinned, and wore such diaphanous robes that Molly first took her for a spectre. The girl vanished out of sight, and Molly was left with an after-image of flowing silks, long ebony hair, and a heart-shaped Asian face made of porcelain. She was still staring at the empty alley mouth when 3 more figures appeared. No grace or elegance this time. 3 heavy, grubby men, in scuffed work boots and thick overcoats, with collars turned up against the night chill. One gripped a bottle of spirits that was mostly empty, and he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand as he followed the girl, an unpleasant glitter in his eyes. His friends followed suit. A short one with a vast gut, and a burly man with no neck and tight curly hair that grew down into thick lamb chops across his cheeks. As this last intruder left the other side of the alley, his alcohol-flushed face rotated one way and then the other, in the time-honored manner of hoodlums everywhere, scoping for eyewitnesses before performing an ugly deed. As she twisted, the glint of a knife appeared in his belt. Molly's expression hardened. It took no stretch of the imagination to understand that the Asian girl was in immediate and life-threatening peril. Seemingly in response to this recognition, a patient shadow detached itself from the alleys behind her and lumbered closer. The largest of her faithful followers. She didn't need to look to feel the strength in this tree-trunk-sized arms, or a sense of layers of stitching that snaked like ivy over the creature's body, holding the musculature of a dozen men together in a single monstrous form. Unbidden, the flesh titan began to stride after the 3 men, opening and closing its massive hands in anticipation. Grabbing Philip's pram, Molly followed, determined to mete out punishment befitting the 3 villains. A high-pitched squeal echoed down the alley, and Molly broke into a run, overtaking her ponderous associate. She hadn't expected the men to attack so soon, but there was still time to intervene before the girl was harmed. She swerved around the corner in pursuit of the assailants, Philip's pram on 2 wheels, and found a violent turmoil engulfing the alley ahead. It was not the girl being assailed by 3 burly men. However, it was 2 men hanging in the air, kicking and squealing like pigs, while they were eviscerated by something. It had no clear shape. An incorporeal whirlwind formed of knives, teeth, and eyes, filled with rage. Organs, flesh, blood, and bone flew the length of the alley as the 2 men's screaming thugs disintegrated, spraying their innards in all directions for 50 feet. The 3rd man, the lamb-chopped bull, was running back along the alley towards Molly. His expression, that of someone whose grasp of reality had temporarily slipped. In his derangement, he made the mistake of running more or less directly at Molly, which her looming agent evidently considered too immediate a threat to be ignored. A flesh fist the size of an anvil swooped over Molly's head, and the 3rd man was smashed into the brick wall of the alley with enough force to pulp his innards and burst him like a blood-gorged mosquito. Blood slopped into Philip's pram, and finally, breaking his 3 days' silence, the disembodied head voiced his disgust. "I say," he moaned, "what's going on out there? Was that really necessary?" Molly wiped at her face, patted her huge charge reassuringly, and focused on events in the alley. The whirlwind was losing its force, diminished steadily until the girl became visible once more. Her arms upraised, her eyes the color of albumen. As the gnashing spirit shape evaporated, the girl's lashing hair and clothing settled, and her dark chestnut pupils returned. In seconds, she was just a slim Asian girl once again, albeit standing ankle-deep in human chum. It was at this point that Molly realized the alley ended in a loading dock behind them. The girl had led the 3 men into a dead end. It had been an ambush, right enough, but the men made the mistake of thinking that they were the predators. The girl lifted her blood-splattered kimono and began to pick her way through the gore on tiny bare feet, with no more concern than one would display while using stepping stones to cross a shallow stream. Molly watched this dainty figure make her way unhurriedly out of the alley mouth, rather envious of her inherent poise and dignity. She glanced down at her ratty dress and scuffed shoes, very conscious of her poor cloth, in the presence of this silk vision, blood-splattered or otherwise. The girl came to a halt a few feet away, looking up at Molly. She was a full head shorter, tiny actually, the perfectly formed doll features, but the specks of warm blood on her neck and cheeks were stark against the milky flesh, and Molly could sense the turmoil and fury that paced behind those big, placid brown eyes. "Hello," Molly said, uncertain of how to proceed. "Konbanwa," the girl said in response with a slight nod of her head. Her gleaming black hair moved imperceptibly. Her face was very still, almost apathetic. "Are you all right?" Molly asked. "Those men didn't hurt you?" It was out of her mouth before she realized the absurdity of the question. "Watashi wa genki desu," the girl said with another bob of her head. Molly hesitated. It was possible that this girl knew no English, in which case further conversation was going to prove difficult. The girl leaned over and looked into Molly's pram. To her credit, her expression didn't change when she found the blood-splattered severed head scowling back at her instead of the expected infant. Philip was so startled that he babbled, "Oh, how very nice to meet you, miss. Please excuse my appearance. I was most unfortunately drenched." Next, she regarded the hulking shape over Molly's shoulder, which shrank back at the passive scrutiny. Finally, the girl turned her attention to Molly. "I like your friends," she said. So I hope you guys enjoyed the first part of that story. If you liked that, and you want to hear the rest of the story, that was actually just the first part of The Last Call at Grey Lord. If you want to hear the rest of it, or read the rest of it, I should say, you should check out Book 2 of Malifaux. Excellent fluff in these books. I love the world that they've created, and this is just to show how much I love this new awesome game that I've discovered. So this is actually the start of the Resurrectionists section in Book 2, and I'd suggest checking it out if you're thinking about getting into Malifaux. Check out all the books, but this one's from Book 2, so if you want to hear the rest of the story, pick it up at your local hobby shop and read away. There's some really cool stuff in these books, so check them out. So until our next encounter, happy Halloween.
Like a monkey in a rocket on his way back home. Okay.